All right. Well, thank you for coming tonight, or tonight. I'm used to saying tonight because normally we have these lectures in the evening, Thursday evenings. But I see that a number of you have noticed, how it is that for the last of these lectures, we moved, and we had to move because Ed Husain had some difficulty just in getting his visa to come over and join us. But I'm so glad that he did. He really brings a unique perspective to this series of lectures this summer on religious violence and apocalyptic movements. He's really lived a lot of this history personally, as many of you already know. He's the author of The Islamist, and this was a finalist for the George Orwell Prize for Political Writing. And since then, he's established himself as one of the most astute and convincing commentators on Islamism, on Wahhabism, on a whole series of conflicts, alas, that has beset the Muslim world. And I have to say, and many of you also know this, is that he is also a very courageous commentator on these issues, and somebody who's been condemned and worse than condemned, both from the left and from the right. But I think that he's a particularly eloquent spokesman for the very basic fundamental principle. When people, for instance, will accuse him of being an agent of one power or another, even the British government, he will point out that no, it is, in a democracy, it is the government that is our agent. And as citizens, we need to hold it accountable. And so in all these ways, it's really an honor to have Ed Husain with us tonight. I could go on about his many other credentials. You can read about them in the bio that you have in front of you. But let me just finally say, before we turn things over to him, that I also want to thank Roger Hertog for making all of this possible. Roger Hertog made the funds available to support the Hertog Global Strategy Initiative and the really exciting research that a lot of our students have been able to do over the course of the summer. So thank you, Roger. So over to you, Ed.
Thank you, Matt, for that very kind introduction. Thank you to all of you for making time on a hot Friday afternoon. I'm sure there are a whole host of other things that you could be doing here in New York, but thank you for making time. And thank you to whoever runs the Twitter account here for the Hertog project. I mean, I keep getting regular reminders, and I've had them for the last sort of 3 or 4 weeks that I'm supposed to be here today speaking. Not that I needed reminding on Twitter, but thanks to whoever's the social media guru here, you do a splendid job. So I'm going to speak about two things broadly, two themes. First is that what is Al-Qaeda? Because too often over the last year and a half, and maybe longer, people have dismissed the threat levels posed by Al-Qaeda. And secondly, I want to talk about developments on the ground, in other words, furnishing you with evidence as to what I'm talking about, and it's not just doom and gloom. And I hope it's not doom and gloom. But to start with then, it's worth saying that Al-Qaeda isn't some kind of corporation with bin Laden, who was at the top. And now that bin Laden's been removed, been killed, been brought to justice, that Al-Qaeda is somehow weaker today. Or perhaps a better way of putting it is Al-Qaeda central at the helm may well be weaker operationally, but my point is that Al-Qaeda is not an organization with a strict hierarchy. Al-Qaeda today, in the hearts and minds of millions of people around the world, means more than a strict organization. It means a form of rebellion, it's an idea, it's a mass movement, it's a worldview, it's a brand, it's a philosophy. You can buy into it from any part of the world, depending on your adopting a set of ideas or not. I will articulate those ideas for you in a moment. But it's worth remembering that if you're looking for 20 guys in the Hindu Kush mountains, and you think you're going to eliminate those 20 guys and therefore Al-Qaeda is eliminated, you've got another thing coming. That's not the way Al-Qaeda has worked. It's not the way it was set up to work. It draws legitimacy and its existence from a whole set of ideas, a religious milieu, a political mindset of grievances, and as I say, I'll come onto those in a minute. Now, the second point to remember is that Al-Qaeda never sought to be a mass movement. Al-Qaeda will not be competing in elections. Al-Qaeda will not be putting forward a presidential candidate in any of the post-Arab Spring countries. What Al-Qaeda is about is ensuring that the ideas, the worldview that it espouses has A, legitimacy, and B, representation in the political sphere, and C, most importantly, implementation. And in the absence of Al-Qaeda's understanding of Sharia being implemented in Muslim majority countries, what Al-Qaeda will do is to continue to agitate from the sidelines, from the margins, to ensure that the center responds to what Al-Qaeda wants. And again, in a moment, I'll bring evidence for what I'm saying as to how Al-Qaeda wants to interact with the political and religious center of Muslim societies post-Arab Spring. Now, there's no doubt about the fact that the Al-Qaeda was a huge, the Arab Spring or the Arab Uprisings were a serious blow to Al-Qaeda's narrative. And here again, I'm not talking about the founding of Al-Qaeda in the 1990s, but the jihadi Salafi worldview, the worldview that thinks that removing people in political office, in other words, killing Anwar Sadat of Egypt or trying to assassinate people in political office is legitimate, is one way of removing an obstacle before they can create the kind of government they want to create. That whole worldview has been around with us since 1953 onwards, if not earlier. And I mentioned 53 because of Sayyid Qutb in Egypt. I don't want to get distracted with all that, but it's just worth remembering that there was a whole series of ideas before the emergence of Al-Qaeda in the 1990s. Now, this desire to interact with the political center is based on several ideas, and the ideas are important because these ideas derive legitimacy from two things: one, theology and religious evidence, and two, politics. So what are these key ideas that Al-Qaeda Central would advocate, Al-Qaeda foot soldiers around the world will embrace, Al-Qaeda's supporters around the world would want to see in some form of implementation or embrace in the world? And what are these ideas that, whether it's Sayyid Qutb in the 1950s, or whether it's Abdus Salam Faraj in the 1970s before he was killed in 1982, or whether it's the Saudi Salafi Wahhabi extreme elements, and I'm not saying all Saudi Salafis are extreme, there are some that aren't, but many are. What are these ideas that they advocate, that they wish for Muslims to adopt, that they wish that are represented by the political center post-Arab Spring? The first idea is what they consider to be their interpretation of Sharia being state law. In other words, Sharia is not just about ritual observation of faith, but it must be implemented as state law. In the absence of Sharia being state law, Muslims are sinful. And if Muslims are sinful, Muslims are going to hell. If Muslims are going to hell, there must be a group of Muslims among the global Muslim community that reminds us that Sharia must be implemented as state law. Now, this part of the narrative, or this part of Al-Qaeda's claim that Sharia must equate state law, has been negated since at least 100 years after the Prophet Muhammad by a whole host of Muslim scholars. During the Q&A we can go through that. But what's interesting here is there are multiple interpretations of Sharia as state law, whether we're looking at the Shia persuasion, the Sufi persuasion, the various Sunni persuasions, or whether, for those of you who are more interested in the detail of the subject, the Maqasid al-Sharia understanding, in other words, the aims of the Sharia. The point I'm making is there is no one reading of Sharia law that must be imposed, implemented, established at the expense of others. To do that is to cut away from pluralism, to do that is to ignore other interpretations of Islam, and in early Muslim scholarship that was always discredited, discouraged. But where we have a situation with Al-Qaeda today is that their interpretation of Sharia must become state law, or otherwise we're all sinful. So that's the first idea of the Al-Qaeda theopolitical appeal, that Sharia must become state law. The second idea is once Sharia becomes state law, that state in Al-Qaeda's narrative, or an extreme Salafi narrative, becomes a caliphate or an Islamic state or a khilafah, or some would call it Hakimiyya, some would call it Dawla Islamiyya. Depending on who you speak to, the generic understanding is it becomes a caliphate. And the problem with opening up this whole discussion about the caliphate is nobody among Muslim communities globally is happy with one interpretation of a caliphate or another. Even when the caliphate existed in Turkey, there were rival caliphates in India, there were rival caliphates in Iran, and in other parts of the Muslim majority world. So from Al-Qaeda's point of view, not only is it incumbent on a religious level for Muslims to have Sharia as state law, but their version of Sharia as state law, which they then declare as the caliphate. So the whole experiment in Afghanistan with Mullah Umar was supposed to be that he was the new Khalif or the new Amir of the Muslims. And with bin Laden, there was a lot of toing and froing about this, whether he was the ultimate, global leader of Muslims or not. Interesting side note that bin Laden gave allegiance to Mullah Umar in Afghanistan under the Taliban because he legitimately believed that he was now the Amir or the leader of the Muslims globally. So the need for a caliphate is central to the Al-Qaeda narrative. The third point, and this is where it gets interesting, because this third element isn't just Al-Qaeda central or its foot soldiers, but people who are from a Wahhabi persuasion, mostly from the Gulf countries. And they've been taught this in school, and when I say this, sometimes Saudi friends get upset, but there is this idea called al-wala wal-bara, al-wala wal-bara, something that none of us growing up Muslims were really familiar with, but came out of Saudi Arabia in the 1980s with a real degree of seriousness. And this is an argument that says Muslims, their definition of Muslims, are loyal only to fellow Muslims, friendships, economic exchanges, preference for hospital treatment, everything must be with Muslims first and only to Muslims. And disavowal or rejection of other communities, not just Christians and Jews, but everybody else. And I single out Christian and Jews because of the Quranic reference to them being people of the book, or people who preceded Muslims in the Abrahamic tradition. So this, bara from them, or the rejection of them, plays into this Al-Qaeda narrative of the them and us mindset. And most Muslims throughout history, and even if you ask the Prophet Muhammad's companions, do you understand what al-wala wal-bara means? They would say no. It didn't compute. But this is a modern idea from the 80s that's been adopted by Al-Qaeda. The evidence for that is, Ayman al-Zawahiri's most recent statement. He talks about al-wala wal-bara. He wrote a whole book about al-wala wal-bara. Osama bin Laden spoke in at least 6 different video statements about al-wala wal-bara. It's central to the premise of the them and us worldview, that Muslims must put Muslims first and everybody else falls by the wayside. Of course, the consequences of that are, you can't open a pluralist mindset. You don't have a multi-religious society. You have minorities that are treated as second or third class citizens. There are real consequences for that argument, and we're seeing the playing out of al-wala wal-bara in Saudi Arabia today. But that's the milder part. But Al-Qaeda would take it to its logical conclusion and say al-wala wal-bara means Muslims can't be part of the United Nations. They've said that. They've said Muslims can't have dealings with the World Bank. In other words, Muslims must create this international ghetto of Muslims only, and you can't do that in the modern world. But that's where the al-wala wal-bara, the third element of the Al-Qaeda narrative, ends up. The fourth element is what they call takfir. And this is dangerous more for Muslims than it is for others, because the reason why Al-Qaeda was killing more Muslims in Iraq or Iraq before the Arab uprisings was because they justified the killing of fellow Muslims on the grounds that people like me and others, mainstream, I happen to be a Sunni Muslim, that we're not Muslim enough. Because we don't embrace Al-Qaeda's understanding of al-wala wal-bara, or the need for Sharia as state law, or their understanding of the caliphate as I just outlined them. If we reject those aspects, what they then declare us is to be kafir or kuffar, non-believers, hence the word takfir, which means to excommunicate, to say we're not Muslims anymore. It's on the basis of this argument, this idea of making takfir, of excommunicating, that they justify the attacks on shrines in Iraq, the exploding of tombs recently in Mali or in Libya, or the attacks on the shrines in Pakistan over the last 2 years. Wherever you see Muslim on Muslim violence, almost always it's justified with this central narrative of Al-Qaeda's idiocy of takfir. In other words, saying someone isn't Muslim. In traditional Islam, in Orthodox Islam over the last 1300 years, declaring someone to be a non-Muslim or to make takfir on them was a huge deal. It wasn't done so easily, so sort of haphazardly. But that's the norm among Al-Qaeda, to render fellow Muslims as non-Muslims and therefore justifying their killing. And on those grounds, the killing of Muslims in Iraq, and on those grounds, essentially, Al-Qaeda shot themselves in the foot, because now the stats are that they've killed more Muslims than they've killed non-Muslims. I'm not for a moment justifying killing of non-Muslims, but the point is Al-Qaeda sees itself as the protector of Muslims, as the defender and the vanguard of Muslims, but it's killing fellow Muslims to make its advance its worldview. The fifth idea, of course, for the Al-Qaeda narrative is jihad. In other words, all of these, the ideas that I've mentioned, must be advanced by physical violence. In other words, if you can't implement Sharia state law, if you can't voluntarily get a caliphate, if Muslims stand in the way of embracing or creating this worldview, embrace violence. Remove them, because jihad of physical violence is justified in order for the greater good, and the greater good here is to create the caliphate, to impose Sharia state law, and to do what they call call to good and forbid evil. The sixth idea underlining all this, and this is perhaps the part that has been driven home most in the West, is, and all of this has been going on in Muslim majority society since 1953, especially in the Arab world. But what's the final idea to this Al-Qaeda narrative is istishhad, or martyrdom. The belief that undertaking jihad and getting killed in its way, or losing one's own life, is to become a martyr, to become a shaheed, to become a witness in the advance of this cause, the advance of these theological, political ideas that I've outlined. And to become a martyr is the most honourable, noble status that they bestow on their dead. But to be fair to them, it's not only them. This is a phenomenon in the Arab world, that whoever dies for a political cause becomes a shaheed, and we've seen that in Syria, with both sides claiming that their dead are martyrs. So, martyrdom is we can talk about this at the Q&A, but they don't become martyrs for 72 virgins in heaven. I can assure you of that. But that seems to be the default understanding here, that it's all about virgins and the heavenly life. The heavenly life aspect is that life continues. In other words, their life doesn't end if you're a martyr. But it's not about it's not about virgins. And if you ask me at the Q&A session, I can maybe go into it more. But so these are the 6 ideas that propel Al-Qaeda. Now, Al-Qaeda was born from that milieu, from that intellectual background. Al-Qaeda did not create these ideas, and the death of Al-Qaeda, or the death of Osama bin Laden, does not mean the end of these ideas. And yet, I give you 2 quotes. Yet, just after bin Laden's death, Leon Panetta said in July 2011, the United States is within reach of defeating Al-Qaeda and is targeting 10 to 20 leaders who are key to the terrorist network's survival. I'm convinced that we're within reach of strategically defeating Al-Qaeda. Leon Panetta. Fareed Zakaria, at a similar date, says Al-Qaeda is over. The truth is, this is a huge, devastating blow to Al-Qaeda, which had already been crippled by the Arab Spring. Fareed's right; it was crippled by the Arab Spring, but I think he's wrong to say that Al-Qaeda is over. So, these are the key ideas, part of the theopolitical narrative that drives Al-Qaeda's appeal among millions of people in Arab and Muslim majority societies. And if you doubt my claim that bin Laden, or that narrative has an appeal, I put this to you. When Osama bin Laden was killed, the White House, John Brennan the morning after, and others went out of the way to say they would not distribute images of a dead Osama bin Laden. They went out of the way and they said, their excuse was, they just didn't want to release those pictures. Now, at the same time, on Arab websites from Al Jazeera onwards, Al Jazeera Arabic website and others, they were touting the US and the White House, saying, well, if you really killed, because there was a denial, immediate denial, it never happened, he's a martyr if it happened, and it never happened. You can't have it both ways, that he's a martyr if it happened and it didn't happen, but they did. And what was interesting was they were saying, give us the evidence. If bin Laden is dead, show us the evidence. And you'll remember that The Guardian then leaked a claimed leak that wasn't a leak. But the point I'm making to all of this is, people in Washington, D.C. know that releasing an image of bin Laden dead would be offensive to a large constituency of people in the Arab world, which would then result to greater anger and anguish and a sense of vengeance than otherwise not releasing them. So there is a feeling, there's a sentiment that this man has an appeal. Now, again, we'll come to some evidence for the appeal in a moment. So those are the ideas. Now, Without doubt, Al-Qaeda was dealt a severe blow with the Arab Spring because Al-Qaeda's whole aim was violence and violent overthrow. That method has failed. But I am of the persuasion, had they not tried that method, younger Arabs of this generation would not have gone for the street. They went for the street knowing that the previous generation of the 70s and the 80s went for assassinations, went for political killings, and they ended up in prison and then, chased out of their countries, and the dictators held control over the country. So trying the democratic method for a younger generation clearly paid off. Now that said, what's going on post-Arab Spring? And I speak as someone who's been visiting the Arab world since then. I've been to Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the Palestinian territories, Israel, and I've been visiting those parts of the world prior to the Arab Spring, and I've lived in Syria for 2 years during the Iraq War. I've lived in Saudi Arabia for about a year, and I've seen the shift, and there's no doubt about the fact that the Arab Spring is, on balance, thus far, good news. I'm not denying that. But we can't be naive and think that the greater free public space in those countries will not then enable others who were traditionally just put behind bars to now emerge and operate in the open, and that's what's happening. And I'll just take several countries very quickly with you. First, you're all witness to what's going on in Libya. The blowing up of the shrines and the militias, but also parts of Yemen that have now been completely taken over near Hadramaut by Al-Qaeda's local franchise. And Al-Qaeda's clerics such as Zindani hold sway in those parts of the country. But the three countries that strike me most, and I know better, Egypt, Tunisia and Syria. Now Egypt is the hub of the Arab world, 82 million Arabs, the cultural center, the intellectual nerve of the Arab world. And when Osama bin Laden was killed, there were several mass funeral prayers for him, janazah prayers held in absentia. Pre-Arab Spring, that was inconceivable that anyone would dare say that A, bin Laden was, someone who was a martyr, and B, required funeral prayers in Cairo and in Alexandria with mosques packed full after Friday prayers. And that's exactly what happened. An endorsement of Osama bin Laden as a martyr and huge prayers. Problem one. Problem two, right in the heart of Tahrir Square from day one, there was imagery of Umar Abdurrahman, the blind sheikh who was behind the first World Trade Center bombing here. And we saw President Morsi, on balance he's been good, but on this issue he's been weak, saying that he would lobby the US for Umar Abdurrahman's release. And to this day, Umar Abdurrahman's people have a huge presence on the I think the most eastern part of Tahrir Square. I've seen that on the 6 visits that I've undertaken. Public presence, nobody will question it, people won't put it aside, and major clerics in the country support that cause of releasing someone who was an open advocate and remains to be an open advocate of endorsing suicide bombing and attacks on the West, and the mastermind behind the first World Trade Center attack. Third, and more recently, the Sinai jihadis, not just their attacks or their attempted attacks on Israel, but also their killing of Egyptian policemen, 16 policemen being killed. On what grounds? On the very grounds that I highlighted earlier, of the belief that of takfir, that they're no longer Muslims because they're serving they're serving a secular government. They consider the current government to be secular. And finally, in Egypt, not just the Sinai situation, but more broadly, the 30% of the first shot of the parliamentary election was from the Salafi brigade. Now, where you have Salafism emerging, almost always you have violent forms of Salafism emerging. The Egyptian public space has become more Islamized. When the public space becomes more Islamized, others say it's not Islamic enough, and then they want a more Salafi form of Islam, and from that we see a more violent form of Islam. Turning to Tunisia, and Tunisia is important because Tunisia is the intellectual pioneer of Islamism, not of the Arab world, but of Islamism. And by Islamism I mean the politicization of Islam. And Rashid Ghannouchi, who's the leader of the Ghannouchi, the Al-Nahda party, is important because he's the only Islamist leader who's fully behind women's rights in his writings, who believes in a secular state but justifies it with Islamic language, and who has more or less made the best outreach to the West, but also in his country has outlined the need for maintaining a secular balance, and he's influenced the Turkish AK party and the AK party in turn seems to be influencing the Egyptians. So he's an intellectual vanguard, and even there in his country, because Ghannouchi and others have said that they will not be implementing Sharia as state law, Ayman al-Zawahiri came out on the 12th of June this year and reprimanded the Tunisian Al-Nahda party, called on Tunisians to declare jihad on him, on the Al-Nahda party, and cited scholarship from the past that more or less underpins Ghannouchi's or the Tunisian progressive worldview. So even Tunisia, relatively liberal Tunisia, is not immune from al-Zawahiri and Al-Qaeda centrals' influence in trying to change where the direction of the political center is heading inside Tunisia. I mean, we can talk about this again in more detail at the Q&A, but the third and most problematic country, I think, post-Arab Spring isn't Yemen, isn't Libya, and to most of our dismay and shock is actually Syria. And I say so because I've lived in Syria, I know the country, I know the clerics, the different factions, the sectarian factions, the Alawis, the Druze, the Ismailis, the Sunni, the Shia, and the various Christian denominations. For the last 30 years, there was relative peace in that country, but not anymore. And at the beginning of this revolution, it was a genuine uprising against the dictator and the warlord that is Bashar al-Assad, Hafez al-Assad's son. No doubt about it, it's a legitimate uprising. But just as the Egyptian revolution is now being hijacked by the Islamists, I'm not saying it's a negative thing, it's a point of fact, just as the Tunisian uprising is no longer a secular liberal sort of command and control, but the more soft Islamist of the Al-Nahda party, the Syrian uprising has, to my mind, been hijacked by Salafi jihadis. I'm not suggesting that they're at the center of events, but the most intense fighting and the most courageous fighters have come from various Salafi jihadi outfits. There are 30 rebel groups. The Free Syrian Army, or the FSA, is one of them, and among the rebel groups, at least 16 to 17 of them are Salafi jihadi fighters. Syria today draws people from across the Arab world. You know, the dead have been identified from not just Jordan, Iraq and Lebanon, neighboring countries, or Turkey, but also from Libya, huge amounts of arms shipments, but also from Tunisia, and more worryingly, other parts of the world, to which I'll come to in a moment. Christian Science Monitor report about 2 days ago about parts of Syria that have been freed and now under what's called free Syria are implementing Sharia state law, because that's the default understanding of what they understand. It's not, it's not freedom and democracy, which was what the initial rebels wanted, but huge areas that the Free Syrian Army controlled are now implementing Sharia as state law. Doubt me, go and read the Christian Science Monitor and see the details for yourselves. The other problem in Syria is that unemployment was nearing 32-33% before the uprisings. After the uprising, that rocketed because security and stability was no longer available. The state was breaking down. What's now happening is it's a cottage industry of 25 to 30 men getting together, dispatching their family members to, say, Jordan or Turkey or the refugee camps in Lebanon. The 25 to 30 men then become a brigade or a katiba, and they become, Kataib al-Ahl al-Sunnah or the Kataib of Ibn Taymiyyah, give themselves various Salafi-sounding names. They then go and kidnap someone who works at a post office or a school, because officially both of those categories are run by the government. So what they're doing is they're kidnapping a government supporter. They put this person on a YouTube video that, look, we've captured Assad's supporters. They work at a post office, they work at a school, they work in whichever government department nearby, and they become the Shabiha or the government operatives. That YouTube footage of kidnapping Assad's supporters then finds its way to the Gulf in Qatar or in Saudi Arabia, and it becomes a ploy for raising funds. And huge amounts of money has, through this route of Gulf support, come into Syria because of this cottage industry of jihad, of fighting against the Assad regime, and then unemployment becomes employment. I got these reports from people who are funded in London to run an opposition television channel, and they're so worried about these developments that they don't want to talk about them publicly, because to do so would be to undermine the Syrian opposition. So that's where the situation seems to be heading in Syria. I wrote a piece in National Review recently explaining some of this, so I don't want to go over it in too much detail, but essentially for Al-Qaeda and Salafi jihadis, Syria is not Syria. They don't recognize the borders that divide Syria from Jordan, from Iraq, from Lebanon, from Turkey and elsewhere. For them, Syria is what they call Bilad al-Sham. Bilad al-Sham was a tract of land that went from Lebanon to Syria to Jordan, included Palestine, Israel, and there were no borders. And the Prophet prayed, he said, Allahumma barik lana fi shamina wa yamanina, bless our Sham, Bilad al-Sham. The Prophet visited Sham. The night journey of the Prophet through Jerusalem includes Bilad al-Sham. For Al-Qaeda, this is central. If there's a second country in the Middle East they want to control more, after Saudi Arabia would be their first preference, it would be Bilad al-Sham, and it's Syria. From Syria, they see Golan Heights. From the Golan Heights, they see Israel. From Syria, they see Turkey. From Turkey, they see Europe. From Syria, they see Hezbollah. From Hezbollah, they see Iran. Syria is absolutely strategically vital for Al-Qaeda. And if you think Al-Qaeda is simply going to walk away from Syria, I just think we're wrong. And whatever happens in Syria, the situation is that things will sadly get worse before they get better. I'll conclude by saying two things. And that is, one of the huge problems with Syria isn't that it's just been a hub for regional jihadis, but it's also been an attractive point for Western Muslims. Huge numbers of Muslims from European countries, recent estimates are up to about 400, have gone from, across Europe to go and fight in Syria. Many of them from Arab background, many of them aren't. But it's what European Muslims underwent during Bosnia, fighting for fellow Muslims in Bosnia, and prior to that in Afghanistan. Syria is fast becoming the new Afghanistan, the new Bosnia. And I want to sort of finish with a quote from a recent quote, 25th June of this year. On the 25th of June, Jonathan Evans, the Director General of MI5, Britain's intelligence service, spoke candidly, and he said, this is in contrast to what was said earlier by Leon Panetta and Farid Zakaria after bin Laden's killing. Jonathan Evans said, today, parts of the Arab world have once more become a permissive environment for Al-Qaeda. And he went on to say, a small number of British would-be jihadis are also making their way to Arab countries to seek training and opportunities for militant activity. As they do in Somalia and Yemen, some will return to the UK and pose a threat here. And that's in the United Kingdom. Now, I'm not trying to put the fear of God in all of you. The point I'm trying to make is if we're aware of this, if we know what's going on out there on the ground, then we can act on it and we can prevent the spread of this virus, and we can try to contain it within Syria and try to disarm, de-radicalize and disengage those people who are heading towards that pathway. And if we're not prepared to accept the problem, if we think somehow Al-Qaeda is our new proxy against the Assad regime, or Al-Qaeda is now our new jihadi allies as we used them against the Soviets in the past, that this is now, the Mujahideen are a good force to get rid of Iran. If we want to ride the Al-Qaeda tiger again, then there are consequences. But if we're prepared to wake up to the risks and the dangers that we face now, going forward we can address them and help create a better world for all of us. Thank you for listening.
Hi, I'm Fiona Blythe. I'm one of the students on the Hertog programme. In your book, you mentioned that freedom of speech in the UK had enabled the growth of Hizb-ut-Tahrir. Sorry, I probably mispronounced that. And that you mentioned just now that the Arab uprisings had given a greater political space and had allowed for Al-Qaeda to have a voice, or extremists to have a voice, that perhaps under dictatorship they would have been put in prison. So I wondered therefore if you felt that dictatorships contained extremism and contained terrorism, and actually freedom and democracy are an incubator for extremism and for terrorism.
Yeah, great question. See, I mean, if the way dictatorships, does this thing work? Can everyone hear me? Yeah, okay. So the way dictatorships have contained extremists have only led to extremists becoming violent extremists, and violent extremists then wanting to become martyrs. And the evidence for that is when Sayyid Qutb, the author of Milestones in Egypt, wrote against the Egyptian government in the 1950s and early 60s. Nasser's response was not to engage with the ideas, not to send clerics from other Muslim persuasions to counter those ideas, but to hang the man for writing the book. He died because of the book being written, so no freedom of speech. So this was Nasser's Egypt. As a result of Qutb being killed, others then took the jihad one step further. That kind of containment or killing or repression or eliminating freedom of speech, I don't think is the way forward, because what it does is it makes the problem worse. It drives it underground. The advantage to having freedom of speech is that it's not that government would counter it. I think it's the responsibility of civil society to counter it, that it allows citizens like ourselves to debate, to discuss, to ridicule, to undermine the very ideas that I outlined during my talk. And that can't be done unless there's a free public space. And where in parts of Britain that Hizb ut-Tahrir were a problem in the 1990s, because of the freedom of speech, and because on college campuses, if I may say so, many of my teachers at the time would basically think that Hizb ut-Tahrir were or Islamist extremists were basically today's communists, because many of my professors, or my generation students, had professors who were in the 50s and were hippies in the 60s. They basically thought that what's wrong with a bit of radicalism, Islamist radicalism, suicide bombing, this is today's Marxism of the third world, let's support it. So the problem is when you start giving them that kind of space unchallenged, then I think it's a real problem. So freedom of democracy, yes, but by challenging extremists, containing them, ridiculing them, poking fun at their ideas, and making them unattractive. And I'll end this answer with one sort of example. In Pakistan, huge amounts of sort of satellite television channels have become the norm, and people are openly allowed to preach whatever it is they want. So the country's now become a huge problem, not just because of the drone attacks, but other issues that have led to anti-Americanism being the norm. Now there are, yes, Pakistan has been opened up by Pervez Musharraf, and now there's a lot of freedom in the air to talk about what people want to talk about, but there's no counter voice to the default extremism that's festering in that country. So freedom and democracy, I think, is going in the right direction, and it is part of the answer without doubt. But it has a responsibility on citizens to know, their rights and what's wrong and what's right. And just to sort of bring one other example, it's interesting that Muslims from European countries are rocking up in Syria, rocked up in Bosnia and in Afghanistan, but not from the United States of America. And there's something to be said about your country in that from a very young age you inculcate in your students what the Constitution stands for, what Jefferson was all about, I assume, and the establishment of religion and the First Amendment and all of that more or less addresses the Islamist narrative from the very beginning. And when these ideas pop up in the public domain, citizens, the US, unlike the UK and other countries, isn't so dependent on government to steer the debate. Citizens are ahead and are prepared to shut down extremists. Anyhow, so yeah.
A few weeks ago, Peter Bergen came and gave a very different tenor to this problem. It was sort of like, get over it. Don't worry about it. It's done. And you, of course, are giving sort of what we've been hearing now for 10 years, except with a new twist, Syria, et cetera. How do you account for that discrepancy? And also, how do you account for the assessment of American foreign policy in the past 8 years? Because one can sort of see that we have problematic outcomes emerging from the two wars we've been involved with, which may leave us with a residue of this for a long time to come. So I'm just curious, first, Bergen doesn't agree with you at all with what you just said, and I'm just wondering, where we're at on this.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's the benefit of freedom, right? I mean, Peter Bergen's entitled to his view and his analysis, and with all respect to him, and I'm entitled to mine, and I see what I see on the ground. I mean, I'm open to the facts being negated, but they can't. Just look at Syria, look at it today, and look at the main actors, and listen to Ayman al-Zawahiri's statements. And I'm in agreement with Peter to the extent that, does the United States of America face an imminent threat today, like it did on the 10th of September, 2001? He would say no. I would say, we don't know, because we didn't know on that 10th of September. And these things are impossible to tell. So I wouldn't be as optimistic as Peter is, but at the same time, I'm not suggesting that, you know, the West focus on the same way that it did on this problem as it did post 9/11. Far from it. What I'm saying is that you know, we're dealing with a new situation, a new world, and you know, there are new threats out there, and we can't just negate them. And if we do as we did pre 9/11, then it will come back and bite us in ways that we hadn't anticipated. And it seems wiser, smarter, and more prudent to address this at this juncture rather than wait for it to get better. So that's how I address the discrepancy. And you know, with all respect to Peter, I think his focus was primarily on Afghanistan and Pakistan. And you know, if you think Pakistan is a better place today than it was 10 years ago, you know, think again. You know, the levels of anti-Americanism are at record high. Entire political movements are being founded on the basis of anti-Americanism in the country. Yes, American foreign policy and drone attacks are a huge part of that, without doubt. But we can explain it for whatever reasons. But the situation is what it is. Anti-Americanism, you know, is at an all-time high in Pakistan for all kinds of reasons. U.S. foreign policy. The U.S. foreign policy, you know, talking about it always lands you in trouble with, you know, one quarter or another. But it would be naive to say that, you know, the United States' actions abroad, especially in the Middle East, were not somehow linked to the anger and the wrath and the sense of grievance that fueled Osama bin Laden and the Al-Qaeda narrative. And yes, bin Laden's first videos were about the troop presence in the Gulf countries immediately after 1991. But I'd say two things. One, those grievances are justified, you know, whether it's about the Arab-Israeli conflict or whether it's about the drone attacks and the collateral damage. But the question is the response. You know, there are ways to respond to that. Why is the response then, unlike in, say, other countries, why is the response suicide bombings? Why is the response of killing innocent Americans? Why is the response killing Muslims who are pro-American or side with liberal ideas? You know, why the response could be a whole host of other things, but it's the response that I think draws on this reservoir of theopolitical ideas. And the second point I'd make is this, that those in the Middle East who make a big deal of Israel's presence and the injustices that take place, whether it's in the West Bank or in Gaza or the settlements, and I speak as someone who's just come back from there about 6 weeks ago, again, those grievances are real. They are real. I'm not undermining them for a moment. But if Israel went away from the Middle East tomorrow, if Israel disappeared, you know, what would change in the Middle East? In real terms, people's lives. How does that impact the very reasons why they went to the streets? Schools, jobs, healthcare, you know, housing, you know, the lack of dignity. So there is a tendency. I'm not saying that's where you're coming from, but there is a tendency here in parts of the U.S. to want to constantly blame foreign policy. Yes, foreign policy needs correction, without doubt. Foreign policy needs greater attunement with the realities on the ground. But foreign policy alone and its injustices on its own do not drive Al-Qaeda. It's one factor, but Al-Qaeda's own grievance narrative, i.e. the lack of its caliphate, the lack of its Sharia state law, the lack of its own al-wala wal-bara being manifest, the lack of its own outward jihad, regardless of US foreign policy actions, would mean that it would still be in business. It would still be in operation. And that being in business may not be as harsh and as powerful as it is now because of the fuel that foreign policy gives it, but regardless of that, it will still be in business. So for me, grievances and ideology go side by side.
Could I just follow up on that? And I wish I had asked Peter Bergen the same question, because I think it's a very fair question to ask, which is, you know, how would you falsify your argument about Al-Qaeda? Like, what kind of evidence would it take for you to think that Al-Qaeda really is a spent force? And yes, it's going to continue as a brand, maybe, but it's going to, in terms of the other kinds of concerns that people would have, it really would pale by comparison with the other kinds of foreign policy challenges, at least the U.S. faces.
That's a really good question, and you know, my first response would be that in which parts of the country, which parts of the world have Al-Qaeda been decommissioned, and you know, they're more or less out of business. And two countries come to my mind. One's Libya, one's Egypt. Al-Gamaa al-Islamiyya in Egypt and Al-Jihad in Egypt, both disengaged from violence, and this is in Egypt, but also the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group in Libya abandoned the Al-Qaeda narrative, abandoned the worldview of calling for violence. And we know that happened because they wrote huge volumes, of correctives that they put out saying why they were wrong, why they no longer call towards violence, and why they think that other Muslim interpretations, Sunni mainstream Muslim interpretations, were legitimate and right. And we saw that with the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group in Libya, and we saw that with the leader of Al-Gamaa al-Islamiyya and Al-Jihad in Egypt in the prisons. Now that happened as a result of the Islamic leadership, the mainstream Islamic leadership in those countries, reaching out to this minority. And I say again that this is a minority, this is a fringe, this is not the mainstream of Islam. So when the mainstream reached out, these people decommissioned their weapons, they disengaged from violence, and some of them de-radicalized, but others more or less disengaged from violence. For me, that's a sign of the leadership coming out and saying those days are over. Translate that to Al-Qaeda, it means Ayman al-Zawahiri or Abu Yahya al-Libi or someone of that caliber saying Al-Qaeda was relevant in the Afghan war. In today's world where the young activists have managed to overthrow dictators without violence, there's no need for that sort of worldview of the near jihad and the far jihad. At that point we can say yes, the intellectual ideas battle is over and therefore actions will start to disappear. But in the absence of that, and in the presence of al-Zawahiri issuing bi-monthly videos encouraging his people to rock up in Somalia, in Yemen, in Tunisia, in Libya, and now in Syria, I think it's just too soon, and we want to be cautious and deal with the beast for what it is, rather than what we hope it should be. Okay, thanks.
Yes, hi. My name is Dr. Polner. I would like to thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I have several questions. My first is a reminder that next week is 9/11 again. I looked over what is going to be discussed on campus, and I found there's practically nothing. It's almost as if, perhaps it's just this campus, is sleeping, or it's not going to take specific action in some way. My real question, though, is what is happening with Iran in all of this? What are they doing? And if we study Egypt economically, the economy has to keep going down and down. Practically nobody in their right mind is going to decide to go on vacation in Egypt now. Tourism is one of the major industries. And with the economy going down and down, and with various other situations going, the activity within the Sinai and so on, which way is Mohammed Morsi going? Is he really doing anything? He claims to be an Islamist. And where do you see all of this heading? From what I hear and what I gather here, the only way it's going to go is to major explosion and violence. And you're the first person I've heard who said that a lot of, well, perhaps I haven't read that much about it, who said that a lot of what's going on in Syria is really Al-Qaeda. That's very frightening. All of this is terribly frightening. I look forward to your answers. Thank you.
Thank you. I should just sort of caveat what I said earlier again by saying I'm not for a moment suggesting that the rebels in Syria don't have a legitimate claim to overthrowing the government, nor am I saying that the rebels are Al-Qaeda. Far from it. Please don't go away thinking that's what I'm saying. No, I'm saying that it's I stand by what I wrote in the National Review, saying that Al-Qaeda has a strong presence within the ranks of the fighters. The various brigades that have been set up receive Saudi Salafi fighting, and the Free Syrian Army has not to this day flushed out Al-Qaeda elements within it. It hasn't. It's just thus far it's refused to do so, and that's just a point of fact. And Syria continues to be a draw for jihadis globally. That's not to say that Al-Qaeda is now dominant. It's not. But it's fair to say that the Muslim Brotherhood is dominant within the Syrian National Council. That's no secret. Everybody knows that. But Al-Qaeda isn't yet dominant. But then, Al-Qaeda's game is never to be the centerpiece, never to be dominant, but to command and control for its agenda from the fringes. 9/11 and campus, that's over to you, Pat, and what happens here next week.
I do what I can.
Or not. Iran. I don't really know much about Iran. I have to confess that it's not my area of specialism, and all I can say on Iran is it's not to be trusted. And I'm not, I'm not there with others who think Iran is about to bomb or nuke its neighbors. I'm not there yet. I mean, I haven't seen the evidence. But then, how do you ever see the evidence of a secretive program? But when President Morsi of Egypt goes to Iran for the first time, this is the first, Egyptian president since 1979 that visits Iran, and he talks about Syria, and Iranian state TV translates that into Farsi as Bahrain. In other words, you're being disloyal to your guest's words. You're lying. You're misinterpreting intentionally what he's saying. That's not cause for building up trust. That just vindicates all of us who are pessimistic and distrustful of Iran's intentions, because this is not George Bush speaking. This is the Egyptian president, an Islamist who's there condemning your ally Iran. And what do? You live translation, you lie, you twist it, you change the name of the country to Bahrain. I mean, these are government officials doing that, so that's not cause for trust. So beyond that, I mean, the implications of the nuclear program, the implications on trusting Iranians, and forgive me. But on Egypt and Morsi, you're right on the economics, but they seem to have applied for a $4 billion aid program with the IMF. Only 3 months ago they were against it. Now they've revisited their own criteria and they seem to be welcoming that. You're right on tourism. You're right on the lack of foreign direct investment. Currency reserves are drying up. Unemployment is high. Tourism has been scared away. You're right on all of those counts. Where is Morsi heading? The good news in all of this is Morsi comes from the trend within the Muslim Brotherhood that's dominated by someone called Khairat al-Shatir. Khairat al-Shatir is an out-and-out capitalist, multimillionaire, deputy leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, owns many of the malls inside Egypt and some of the largest brand names, very close to this Turkish model, so more interested in capitalism than they're interested in promoting 1960s socialist-type Islamism. So there's good news on that front, that they do want to recuperate Egypt, and they do want to sort of build Egypt on strong economic footing. And from what I've heard from IMF officials who visited them and other officials from NGOs who've gone and spoken to the economic team or the economics team of the Muslim Brotherhood, they've come away more impressed with that outfit than they have of some of the more liberal left-leaning organizations in town. Because when they go and meet the secular organizations, the discussion is always about more aid. But with the Brotherhood, it's been about aid, but also trade. They're keen to build up the country's economy. Time will tell whether they succeed or not, but what Morsi's got going against him is geopolitics. What might happen with Iran, what might happen with Syria, with Israel on its borders. And one of the great things about the Arab Spring thus far has been that it's not been about destruction, but about construction. It's been about building their own countries and internal grievances within each country. But Arabs, forgive me for saying so, are an emotional people, generally, And when the Arab-Israeli conflict riles up again, as it inevitably will, and it does every 5 to 6 years, and we're crossing the 5-year mark after Gaza, you'll see Egyptians will get angry and annoyed and resort to flag burning and heading towards the border in Sinai and attacking the Israeli embassy, and the Muslim Brotherhood will start to issue loud noises. The moment that happens, you scare away investors, you scare away tourists, you bring economic damage to your country, and that's what I worry about. The Arab-Israeli issue flaring up again and bringing damage to Egypt. But thus far, on balance, yes, Morsi has done 3 things wrong, from press freedoms to, on issues of the constitution and whatnot. But thus far, the good news is that it's not been an extremist government, and those people in DC that threatened the Brotherhood would be, immediately declaring war on Israel, tearing up the peace treaty, and forcing all the women to veil, and sort of forbidding the banning of alcohol. I mean, they were wrong, and I think they will continue to be wrong. So on balance, the jury's out, but thus far it seems to be good news.
Thank you. Well, that's right now, that's the case, what you just said. And history has a way of taking turns unexpectedly. But what seems to be your point, at least what I'm getting from it, is that these issues in the Arab world in this region are going to either be settled by Arabs themselves, that things will work out, or there'll be some other force. There'll be some other, possibly external force, maybe even the United States and its policy that might have a role in calming things down. So I would say, in terms of your estimation in American foreign policy, do you think it appears to be based on the democratic platform that was just accepted, the United States is pulling away from its commitments in the Middle East and pivoting towards Asia? And do you think that if that continues, some of those issues and concerns in the region, Middle East, will get worse?
Would you kindly introduce yourself? Your good name.
Excuse me? I'm Mel Maskin.
Okay, thank you. I ask because I often worry about trip questions, you know. But look, the United States of America, on the broad foreign policy question, must do what's right for the United States of America. The US comes first, and one of the reasons why people like me who aren't Americans that are drawn to this country is because you know, this is a country in which there's vibrant debate about, you know, what it means to be American, the priorities of this country, and what makes this country great. And anything that compromises the greatness and, you know, punctures the US confidence around the world and US moral authority, you know, whether it's in the short term or the long term, ought to be questioned. And to my mind, you know, if the democratic platform and Jerusalem and whatnot, I mean, I don't want to go into that because I just think, you know, it's a local problem for the Arabs and the Israelis to sort out, and it's not for a, you know, power like this country to be getting involved in the details of that part of the world to that extent at this, you know, in a pre-election setting. But if it is in the economic interests of the US to look more towards Asia, then it should and it must. The United States of America comes first, and that includes if, you know, I mean, let's be blunt. Israel can look after itself. You know, Israel has enough nuclear and other weapons arsenals to defend itself. On the Arab streets, Israel is feared. Regionally, it's a superpower. And 60 years after its modern founding, what more can Israel ask for? If it has issues in terms of its neighbors, whether it's the difficulties it has with the Sinai in Egypt or the Golan Heights, Israel should be talking to its own neighbors, you know, and not drawing in the authority of the US repeatedly. That then leads to the US being compromised in the eyes of, you know, 300 million plus Arabs. My contention is this, that if the US and its goodness and its virtues are understood and supported and accepted by ordinary Arabs and Muslims in that part of the world, then the US is a stronger arbiter, a stronger guarantor of Israeli security in the region. In other words, the US is seen as a friend of Arabs and Muslims. And before 1956, the Suez Crisis, the US was seen as a friend of Arabs and Muslims. The US in 1956 went against Britain, against France, against Israel, and sided with Egypt. And it had huge amounts of political capital in the region. If by siding by Israel repeatedly and blocking, you know, UN motions and being seen to be a biased player in the region, what the US does is it undermines its own credibility in the region and therefore compromises Israel's security too. So if you want to come to it in terms of Israel's security, then I'd say, you know, being on better terms with the Arabs helps the US help Israel. And you go the other way around and you weaken the US, you weaken Israel, and you enrage people in the region, and I'm not sure who wins in any of this. Sorry, do you want to come back? I'm sure you've sort of, you look very frustrated, you know.
That's essentially, okay, so now what's good for the United States, we can then throw our friends under the bus, the friends can take care of themselves, our allies, and let's walk away from the situation. The United States has to make choices. Every country makes choices in terms of foreign policy. And if the United States walked away from its commitments in the Middle East, do you think the Arabs would say, well, you know, things now, we can accept the existence of Israel, we can accept US bases on the Arabian Peninsula, and everything is going to be fine and dandy. Can't we all get along? I don't know if that's going to be the case. I think that just might strengthen them and encourage them a little more to take action. Thank you.
Sure, I mean, thanks for the sort of response, and I appreciate where you're coming from, but I mean, I'd say this, and I'm not sort of rebutting what you're saying. I respect your position, but anti-Americanism isn't as widespread in countries such as Saudi Arabia. When I was there about 12 weeks ago, I was with the president of the council, Richard Haas, and I was shocked by the level of warm welcome across Saudi society. And even there, again and again, 3 points came up, and I don't want to go into the detail, but one of them was, the perceived bias of the United States towards Israel. And to question, Israel's relations in the region is not to throw it under the bus, is not to abandon it, but to build better relations with its neighbors in order to ultimately help strengthen it. Anyhow, we differ on this, and I see where you're coming from. You probably see where I'm coming from, but, we agree to disagree. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. My name is Dawood Kevin Barrett Bilali, and despite the Brooks Brothers tie, I am a Muslim, very much Muslim. And but I was born here in America, and I'm thinking that you were born in England, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
And wanted to commiserate with you as a Muslim to Muslim. I am Dawood Kevin Barrett Bilali, but I use my name Kevin Barrett because in this society and moving around, it's very difficult to be a Dawood Bilali. So my business and everything I do is Kevin Barrett. And I have a couple of questions, and I was just curious, in your situation, or maybe dilemma, why you changed your name from Muhammad Husain to Ed Husain. I also wanted to ask about your perspective of this feared state called the Caliphate, and the establishment of a caliphate that, as for Muslims, is something that Muslims are not afraid of. And I don't know how many Muslims come to events like this and present themselves, and because I came here to Peter Bergen's presentation, and I'm always hearing one side, and this is a place of freedom, and the freedoms that we all enjoy, and I wanted to at least impart another side to this. And the establishment of the caliphate is almost as dear to Muslims as is everything about Islam. Having a leadership and having some kind of direction in this world that has a lot of what I see as the beginnings of moral decline. And you talked about Wallah wal Bara, which is a concept that says that this place is for Muslims, and maybe only for Muslims, as is the Al-Hajjaz, which is the Mecca and Medina. And you said that if this was established, it would become an international ghetto. Those were your words. And I just wanted you to expound upon this concept or idea that a Muslim world that was not pluralistic and secular in its extent would become an international ghetto. You also mentioned that at the end of your presentation that this would prevent something about preventing the spread of this virus, and I think that you were talking about Islam or jihadism or terrorism, or I don't know.
What do you think? You think I'm talking about Islam as a virus?
No, but you
okay, well, why say that then?
The expression, see, because as a Muslim, I'm not afraid of an Islamic state. I'm not like Egypt is happening right now. I just read in the New York Times that women are starting to become more with hijab and wearing clothing that is prescribed by their religion. More social agencies the spread of Ikhwan Muslimin is going all throughout Egypt. And all these signs, all these things, to me, say that there's going to be eventually an establishment of a caliphate, or an establishment of all these countries coming together, between Turkey, which has already changed despite Kemal Ataturk and his change of the mindset of the people there, that they're going back to Islam. And I just wanted you to maybe express those two statements at least, and maybe also why there's such a fear of an Islamic state, an Islamic perspective in the world.
Sure. Okay, where to begin? But let's start with the first question first, the personal element. My name, on my passport, on official documents still is Mohammed Hussein. I'm not ashamed of it, I'm not afraid of it. But my contention is this, that if Anthony can become Tony, Mohammed can become Ed. If Andrew can become Andy, Mohammed can become Mo. You might want to ask Mo Farah, the Olympic winner in England, of Somali extract, why he shortened his name from Mohammed to Mo. I don't think it's just the shortening of the name, and I don't think it's a big deal. I don't think we should read too much into it. And this is the land in which people have their initials as their names. A.B. Chivers goes as Andrew Bowen Chivers goes as A.B. Chivers and whatnot. So it's just a personal preference, and honestly, I just don't think it's making a statement about the West or Islamophobia or anything along those lines. It's just a preference to have the name shortened rather than, how many Mohammeds are there in this world? Just all too many. So to shorten it to Ed is, sorry? Yeah, and some people might not necessarily want to be, when I was in Mecca, honestly, I lived in Jeddah. When I was in Mecca, people say, "Ya Muhammad," and at least 15 people would turn around and look. That's all it is. I'm not making any more of it as a big deal than that. That's all it is. So, having put that to bed, Muslims are not afraid of the Islamic State. I'm not so sure about that, and I'll say this for the following reasons. We should distinguish between two things. One, Islam the religion, and two, Islamism the political ideology. Islam the religion goes back to the time of the Prophet Muhammad. To my mind, it's the Prophet Muhammad contemplated, meditated in Mecca in the Ghar Hira at the time in a mountain, much like Buddha and others contemplated, in that part of the world. And what he received, his interaction with Gabriel, to my mind, is the finalization of the interaction that Abraham, Moses, Adam, Jesus, and others had. And, he was part of the Abrahamic tradition. I am a Sunni Muslim, and I have no qualms about that, and I'm as proud as can be about that. But at the same time, that tradition that he left behind was a spiritual pathway. He spoke about, the afterlife. The vast majority of the Quranic injunctions are about kindness and forgiveness and humanity and whatnot. And, those themes are universal. But something happens in history, various understandings of Islam and what Islamism is. But for our purposes, what I would, impeach on you to do is to distinguish between Islam, the faith, the religion, from the Quran, the Sunnah, the Hadith, and the various readings of it, Sunni, Shi'i, Sufi, and whatnot. And then look at the modern Islamist project, from Hassan al-Banna's writing, to Mawdudi's writings, to Sayyid Qutb's writings, to Nabhani's writings, to Abdul Salam Faraj's writings, and to where the extremes, Al-Qaeda, have ended up. In other words, Muslims are not a faith community, that we are a political bloc. This was in response to Karl Marx's language of the bourgeois versus the proletariat, the global workers rising. So Mawdudi's project was global Muslim ummah rising. Historically, Muslims have never been united as one ummah. It's one of the largest myths that we're told. Look at the Safavis, look at the Mughals, look at the Ottomans and beyond. They were fighting one another. The Prophet's own grandchildren were at war. We can go into the details for as much as you want, but the bottom line is, this whole notion that Muslims are a political bloc and they unite together as a political bloc is cloud cuckoo land thinking. It never existed in history, and it won't happen in the future. Indonesians have very little in common with Turks, and Turks have very little in common with Yemenis, and Yemenis in return have very little in common with, say, Muslims from the subcontinent. So therefore, to think that this is some kind of future project which we should all be working towards, that some kind of Muslim global domination, and then subjugating the rest of the world to some kind of jihad and onslaught, we've been there with the gates of Vienna. We saw the damage that it did. For me now, the reality is this, that Muslims are not going back to that world. Where we are living is a pluralist, modern, globalized, interdependent world. And in that, our role, and I say this to you as a fellow Muslim from a Sharia point of view, is to embrace the maqasid al-Sharia arguments, which is that Sharia, and John Locke was influenced by these arguments that were articulated by Ibn Ashur, and before that by Imam al-Harmain and others. That and those of you who haven't thought about this, you may want to look at this. That and I used to write a blog called The Arab Street, and I've written about it on this blog post, that the Sharia was historically to guarantee 5 things: human life, property, the mind or the intellect, and family, and there was one other point which I forget now. So the Sharia was there to defend those 5 things. Now, there was a whole body of legal jurisprudence in the 13th century in North Africa. Before that, Imam Ghazali's teacher wrote about this maqasid al-Sharia. That some claim, the codification of this influenced John Locke. And John Locke's teacher in Oxford, Pocock, studied in Damascus. So there is a serious line of thought, intellectual tradition here from Muslims codifying maqasid al-Sharia to Pocock, to Locke, to then Jefferson and others here. And you may question it, but my appeal to Muslims is embrace that tradition of, live and let live and coexistence rather than confrontation and domination, because that world is over. And if we want to head towards that world, be my guest, but anticipate war and its consequences. The other point you raised about international ghettos, I mean, any community that thinks it's going to sort of close in on itself and cut itself off from the rest of the world, to my mind, is ghettoization. I was born in London, my parents came from British India, I now live in New York, I travel across the world. I want that world to be as it is, and I want to protect that world as it is. In other words, interdependent and globalized. And I don't think most Muslims in the Arab world actually would want to sort of create some kind of Arab state for themselves. The evidence for that is, I find when I go to Israel, Israelis are more concerned about what's going on in Syria, out of empathy, apathy, and other reasons, than my Egyptian friends are at the moment, because Egyptians have far bigger issues on their own plates. So, I'd sort of, beg of you to sort of, rethink Islam versus Islamism. And Mawdudi's tradition was influenced by Marxism. Sayyid Qutb was influenced by communism. They were struggling between capitalism and communism, and they came up with something called Islamism. Traditional Islam is much more forgiving, tolerant, pluralistic, and the Maqasid al-Sharia arguments helps us, I think, come to terms with modernity as it is, and we should embrace that for our own benefit, but for the benefit of our own children and those that come after them.
Hello. My name is Tanya Bhattacharya, and I'm asking this question looking entirely towards what you suggest the solution should be. Which is how do we move from here. And I was trying to understand not to conflate Islam and radical Islam. So my question is about what you claim is the whole ideology that started in around 1953 and from that time onwards, and perhaps had no reason to have currency then, and yet somehow, for whatever reason, still seems to have growing currency or still persisting currency in various parts of the Arab world. And I don't understand why, but I was trying to understand whether ideology flourishes in and of itself for no reason at all, or whether it's rooted in actual ground realities. And in that sense, if we do not understand why it is becoming popular in some places today, will we ever be able to solve the problem just by, say, ridiculing or making fun of these ideologies? And, and I ask this from a perspective because I come from India, where also in many ways radical Islamic ideas are on the rise in some quarters, but the response to be more and more hatred and fear is only making the problem worse, because you do neglect the fact that if you look at certain hard facts, Muslim communities in the country do not do that well. So they are less employed in government, they're economically poorer off, literacy rates are lower. So I'm just trying to say that ideology and certain radical ideologies, in my experience, are more rooted in areas when people have very real grievances. And I don't see the problem being solved by just ridiculing these ideas without tackling the ground reality. And if you think that's the case with Arab world as well.
Sure. What you allude to is true, that socioeconomic grievances are part of the story, but say, comparing Muslims in Europe, for example, or Muslims here, many of them aren't of a sort of socioeconomically deprived background, and yet among upper echelons of certain extremist Islamist groups, that same ideology resonates. Because so while socioeconomic factors are one factor, it doesn't always explain, why Muslims, say in London, who are bankers, accountants, engineers, lecturers at elite universities, why is it that they've embraced that same ideology? No, they're not working towards jihad, but they certainly sort of entertain this, radical, confrontational, them and us worldview, and recruit students towards smaller meetings or cell structure meetings. So the socioeconomic factor doesn't always explain everything. I think there are several other factors at play, although I'm not taking what you've said away from you. I think that's important. The other factors are as follows. Bernard Lewis, I'm not always given to quoting Professor Lewis, but I think on this instance it's worth hearing him out on this. He made a very powerful point when he said, historically, most Muslims around the world throughout history have been in a position of power. So whether it's the Mughals in India, a minority, but yet in power in India for 300 plus years before the British arrived, or whether it's the Ottoman Turks across the Arab world, or whether it's the Safavids in Persia, or you know, in Tataristan, where Muslim minorities were in positions of power. Wherever you look historically, large groups of Muslims were always in a position of power, even when they were in a minority, India being a case in point. So what's happened is, after the end of empires, Muslims haven't yet adjusted to a position of citizenship, you know, a position of being first among equals, if that. You know, there is yet this mental complex of wanting to dominate, wanting to be in power, wanting to impose on others what we think is correct, you know, for ourselves, both religiously and politically. And now I see that playing out in Pakistan in a big way, you know, this complex of my form of Islam is only right and I must dominate, even among Muslims, you know, this desire. There are exceptions to that, and India is an interesting exception where, you know, the works of Husain Ahmad Madani and others show us that, you know, Indian Muslims might be heading towards a different trajectory. Based on that mentality of wanting to dominate, to rule, to govern, a sense of that we have the best form of government, we have the best understanding of what the afterlife consists of, the neglect of that leads to the second point, which is, you know, not being in that position of power, not being a superpower globally, which has been the Muslim trajectory for the last 1,000 years, not being in a position of, you know, equality with other superpowers, whether it was the, you know, the Austrian Habsburg Empire, whether it was the British Empire, whether it was the, you know, the Byzantines on their last days as the Umayyads were rising. Whatever the point of contest is, if Muslims aren't in a position of power, there's a feeling sometimes of humiliation. You know, we were once powerful, we ought to be powerful. If we're not powerful, it's a la'na from God, it's a curse from God, and we feel collectively humiliated in the rise of the West, or the rise of China, but more the rise of the West. So to correct that humiliation, then, we must then plan for an equal form of Muslim rising, of Muslim unity that then counters the West, you know, better still overtakes the West, or at least confronts the West. You know, so what you see is an imitation, a shallow level of imitation of, you know, if it's Coca-Cola, it's Qibla Cola. If it's capitalist banking, it's Islamic banking. If it's a bikini, it becomes a burkini. You know, if it's General Motors, then it becomes an Islamic car in Iran. Why is the car Islamic? Because you've got a glove compartment in which you can put your, you know, anyway, so I mean, I can go on, you know, you switch the car on and an Islamic prayer comes on. It's kind of a gimmicky form of Islam which isn't rooted in tradition or depth or intellectual intensity. So there is that, you know, the humiliation and the desire to compete, and therefore the radical ideology offers solutions to this. It offers serious answers to these questions of existential angst, to this collective feeling of humility, of humiliation. The third factor, that there is a lot of money involved in the proselytization of this ideology. Saudi Arabia and the universities of Mecca and Medina and their graduates earn a living out of being advocates for that worldview. Many of them have abandoned the jihadi element, but the belief to al-wala wal-bara and khilafah and sharia are maintained. And the last point, and I can see Matt giving me the look, I'll sort of you know, go back to the audience. The last point is identity, you know, and it's most of us Muslims, you know, haven't come to terms with the modern world for what it is. You know, there is that desire deep within us that, you know, we're you know, my generation of Muslims, you know, we're second generation in Europe. You know, many of the Muslims here in America are sort of second, third generation American Muslims. And I think of all the countries I've visited, American Muslims seem most to be comfortable with their, you know, with being Muslim here, notwithstanding what you said earlier when I compare it to, say, European countries. And that same identity crisis of what it means to be Muslim today, what it means to be Arab, what it means to be Pakistani is playing out today as we speak in Pakistan and in the Arab world. And in the absence of a clear, you know, scripturally rooted, relevant to the modern world answer to what it means to be a modern Muslim, the old narratives still hold sway, because they're the ones with the answers that say, you're not an Arab, you're not an Egyptian, you're not a Pakistani, you're a Muslim, full stop. That identity comes first. Your responsibility is not to integrate into the modern world, but to separate and to create your own block that confronts. Your responsibility is to call the rest of the world to our form of Islam as the only true form of Islam. Those answers are convincing if you don't know, an alternative tradition on which you can stand. So I'd advance those answers as, several causes as to why radical ideology can be compelling for people.
Okay, thank you, Ed. I think, Jason, you will have the last question. Okay.
So in your book, you describe in great detail how Islamist movements recruit people to join. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the mentality of the people who join, if you noticed any similarities of what they think about, and what do Islamists, what do they draw upon when they're looking for people to recruit, and what is it about the rhetoric that resonates with young Muslims?
Good question. And in terms of what is it about the rhetoric that resonates, again, several things come to mind. One is that what was fascinating for me to see in London, but also then more recently in Egypt and travels in other parts of the Muslim/Arab world, is, and this goes against conventional wisdom, but I think the research by people like Mark Sageman has made this point, and I saw this firsthand in the 1990s. People who were religiously rooted, in other words, if you were an observant Muslim, and I'm not talking about the modern robotic form of just just praying 5 times a day and doing rituals and just ticking off the boxes like an accountant and hoping to land in heaven one day. Not that kind of Islam, but the Islam of the old, Islam of our parents' generation, that was inherently spiritual, that was that called towards veneration of the old, that valued poetry of Rumi, of Hafiz, of Khayyam, of Iqbal even in Pakistan, that drew towards the Sufi mystical traditions that resonate inside Islam now for 1300 years, that believed in miracles, that honored the shrines of saints as a place that was holy, that looked towards people of other faiths as brothers and sisters of the same Abrahamic tradition, and if they were Hindus and others, that they were also people who had a religious tradition that ought to be recognized, much like the lines of, say, Dara Shikoh in India. That kind of Islam, the mainstream Indian Hanafi Islam, or the mainstream Islam of the Egyptian Sufis, which happens to be the mainstream Islam in Egypt, but also in Syria, in Jordan, in Yemen. That kind of coexistential, historical, rooted, scriptural, orthodox, traditional Islam, that can accommodate the modern world. That form of Islam, and those who were exposed to that Islam, those who grew up in that form of Islam, and that who understood scripture from that point of view, were less reluctant, were less given to joining extremist groups. And if they did, they left very quickly because they realized what they were being sold was a new project. What they were being told about was a political idea. What they wanted essentially from these groups was, activism, not contemplation, not worship, but activism. So, immediately those people, would last a year, 2 years if they joined, and they quickly withdraw. So religion is, to my mind, an antidote to that worldview, and I've seen that play out over and over again. And if you look at in Pakistan or India or in the Arab subcontinent, in the Arab world, those who have a religious education rarely join. And the evidence for that is, look at the leaders of these groups, whether it's the Muslim Brotherhood or others, very few of them are clerics, because they know that these are modern innovative movements that are responding to the ideological battles of our time. That's the first point. Religious rooting tends to keep people away, and people in those groups weren't necessarily of genuine religiosity. And when when I joined, what I saw inside many of those groups are people who couldn't read the Quran, people who didn't know the basics in terms of religion, but were very keen to be talking about politics. And the third point that I'd make is that most of the people that are drawn towards these groups are drawn on university campuses, now more in prisons and whatnot, but in those days at least, and still in the Arab world, on university campuses. And normally students who are studying engineering and medicine, You know, and again, look at Mark Sageman's work and look at the profile of the leaders of most of these groups. Either they have PhDs in engineering or they're medical doctors. You know, so what that means is approaching scripture from a instructive point of view. In other words, you know, do, don't. It's like a DIY manual. If you do A, you get B, you get C. You know, formulaic Islam. In other words, metaphor, poetry, context, you know, nuance, caveats, scholarship of the past, all that gets lost as you do in a liberal education. So you know, that was another sort of interesting point that research has proven, but one saw inside those groups. And the final point would be this: identity. People who had an identity crisis joined those groups or accepted the narrative more readily. Inside Egypt, those who came from the countryside into Cairo or Alexandria more readily joined the Muslim Brotherhood and jihadi groups afterwards than those who were already in those cities, or those who had a more rooted sense of their own worth or identity and weren't moving in the class structure, trying to move upwards. Anyhow, there you go. Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you so much again, Ed Husain. That was terrific. Just say one last thing, since this is our last event this summer. We're going to be gathering again next summer for a whole series of lectures, also a research program on climate change and global governance. So those of you, if you're students and that sounds interesting to you, then do keep that in mind, and it's something you might be interested in, and you'll be hearing more about it, and obviously I hope you'll apply if that interests you. And those of you who just like to come to our lectures, we're very happy to have you, and so I hope you'll join us again next summer. So thank you again, and thank you, Ed.
Thank you. Thanks.
Okay.
Cheers.